Welcome, Feel Good Fathers. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm joined today by John Brantley. He's a dear friend. Whenever we get together, we always extend our meetings and have a couple of great conversations. He's the CEO and founder of the Auxin Leader. We'll get into that in just a little bit. He's also a thought leader for leadership in the 21st century. And that Auxin Leader is all about developing leaders to develop their people to drive growth in their companies. And then also, he does family events for active duty military members. John, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it's great to be here, Jay.
Yeah. We have this conversation all the time, and I've had the privilege of hearing you kind of tell me and update me on the story about your family, about your great uncle, about your great grandfather. I'd love for you to tell the Feel Good Fathers about this, and we can kind of jump into the convo.
Absolutely. My great uncle grew up in the house with us. And so, Uncle Bim, as we used to call him, was just a great friend for me, a great companion as I was growing up. And Uncle Bim would tell me stories about the family. And one of the fascinating stories was that my great grandfather was a physician during the Civil War in Marietta, Georgia. It's actually in Ackworth, just right above Marietta. And back then, physicians were one of the real central players in every community. So he owned most of Ackworth, and he actually owned property in the stockyards in Atlanta, which is now downtown Atlanta. And his oldest son enlisted in the war, went to fight, and he got word that his son was ill. So he left everything, went north to try to find his son. He found the unit, uh, and unfortunately, his son had passed away not but a few days before he arrived. But he stayed on to take care of wounded soldiers for a while, and then he got sick. Tried to make it back home so he could recover back home. Along the way, he died. And his wife remarried just not just before, but his wife remarried before the end of the Civil War. And just before the end of the war, she and her new husband sold everything they had for a trunk full of Confederate money. So, in a matter of one stroke of a pen, they became basically worthless,
Hmm.
useless. In turn, not useless, but they became paupers just
Hmm.
almost overnight. As a matter of fact, there's a house still in Marietta somewhere that has the walls that are papered with Confederate money. And the
Hmm.
family story is that's my family's house. Uncle Bim would tell me that story, you know, every once in a while when I was growing up, but it really stuck in my head. And I also began as I became an adult to look at the men in my family. And from that moment, really all the way through until now, what I really observed was that we had men that struggled in the family. All of the men almost. They struggled to figure out who they were, to find out what their path was going to be. And Uncle Bim, I thought, in the midst of telling those stories, also said, John, I want you to reclaim the family name.
Hmm.
Um, and somehow I got that in my head that that was Uncle Bim telling me that. What I began to realize as in the last probably 5 or 6 years is I don't know if Uncle Bim told me that or if I wanted
Hmm.
to tell me that. And so my entire adult journey has been about how do you change that script? How do you change that story as a family? Because those generational stories will go from one generation to the next until someone decides they don't want to and don't have to take that story with them anymore. They can change. They can create a different story for their family. One of the really moving moments for me recently was in a conversation with my oldest son, who's now 40. And I was telling him that story again. And I said, one of the things that I've worked hard to try to do is to create a different script for you guys.
Hmm.
And he immediately responded, Oh, Dad, you don't have to worry about that because you've already changed that story. And I thought, oh, isn't it powerful that we have within us the ability in just one generation to change the story for the family, to help the next generation discover that there are different options. We don't have to follow the path that
Mm,
people before us followed. We can choose a different path. We can have a different impact. We can build a different relationship with ourselves,
mm.
with our children.
I think this aspect for Feel Good Fathers is so powerful because I remember one of the most meaningful moments for me when I got married was that my father-in-law turned to me and he said, it was like in the post-marriage party, or it was like kind of a smaller family gathering, and he just turned to me and he said, "Hey, just so you know, you now get to choose the direction of your family." And
Wow.
I thought that the what I loved about every time you were telling me this story was it just reminded me, and as we were in community, it reminded me of my experience about how I had somebody part of my, like part of my generation, like my father-in-law, my elders calling me into being. And I thought that aspect I thought was just so awesome. And I'm just not sure if that is an experience that most feel good fathers have.
Yeah, um, and I guess that's an individual kind of response to that. But my instinct is that um, most men don't necessarily have that conversation because we're really good at doing as men,
Right.
but we're not so good at discussing, and we're not so good at giving people permission to
Mm,
think and act in a way that's different than how we act.
that's so fascinating. Uh, walk me through this a little bit more, because I think there's some gold nuggets here.
So as men, I don't know where anthropologically or genetically, I don't know kind of where it comes from necessarily, but most guys seem to be wired to do, and we get value and meaning out of doing things, out of
Mm,
fixing things, out of achieving things.
mm,
And there is less energy and focus on developing
mm,
and helping others see and creating an environment where people discover for themselves new things that are possible in their lives. I don't think it's a skill set that we've really fostered and developed very much. And do you sense the same thing or something different?
I definitely think that when it comes to men's groups, like when I think about sports and I think about anything competitive that I've done, whether it's being a part of a team professionally, when I was, especially when I was making games, there was certainly a unspoken standard. It's like there's a level of performance that we expect, and you either exceed that and therefore are in, or you don't exceed that expectation and standard and therefore you are out. And this being very related to the developing side, right? It's just kind of like you're expected, or I felt like I was expected to just figure it out. And then once I hit it, then the magic thing happened.
Yeah, and
But I,
we
mhm.
go ahead.
I was gonna say I think the other part though is when I look at the references in mythology, in story, in movie, and when I think of all the different interviews of successful entrepreneurs, successful business people, many professional athletes, and even right now, I'm reading through Extreme Ownership and hearing Jocko. There is I would say that one of the common themes in all those different situations and elements is that character of the mentor. That Star Wars, Luke Skywalker is mentored and called into action by Obi-Wan Kenobi. And so I think that it's built in that we desire that mentorship. We desire um, someone to direct us. But I think our conversation is the inverse, is that we have the opportunity to be Obi-Wan. So
Correct.
we have and I think even if we're going to follow this analogy, right, it's almost like if we can impart and help develop the next hero. And then so we're not necessarily the hero. Um, what's your response to that piece?
So, Joseph Campbell, when he traveled around the world, going to tribes and civilizations, and found that common hero's journey uh, in all of them, one of the dynamics, and this is what's different today than back then, was in all of those cultures, they had the hero's journey, but they also had a built in mechanism. There was built in structure in the community
Mm,
for that to happen. And so uh, it's when we talk about leadership and parenting, both, there are skills that you can teach people. And then there's environment and culture. And culture is actually what it is that facilitates growth
mm,
uh, in almost all situations, whether it's at home, whether it's at work, doesn't make any difference. And so when Joseph Campbell interviewed those folks years ago, they had the culture in place that supported that Obi-Wan Kenobi experience
mm,
for young men to move them forward. Now fast forward to today, we live in a different culture.
right.
And so it's and we've had two or three generations of not having a structure of really how to do that in culture. And so I think that a lot of folks just feel like they're out on their own trying to do it.
Mm. This is really fascinating because this maps to sort of the modern conception of what is the family unit. If we're going back 3 generations, we're really talking about the beginning of the Industrial Revolution,
Yeah,
about 150 years ago. And so in that timeline, we're leaving the rural farm agrarian cultures, moving into what did they call it? It's like urban consolidation. Every time I have this conversation, I have to think about what the term is. But when everybody moves to the cities
right.
for the Industrial Revolution, like pre World War I, kind of in that time, that the family unit sort of broke apart because work changed and how much time both the parents had at home and in the raising. And one of the uh, uh, big results of that revolution was that dad typically was working like 12 to 16 hours a day. He was waking up and then like he was basically in his home to sleep. There's almost nothing else going on. And he might have had a break for church, right? That was just about it. And
Yeah.
so I can see this idea of that. I call that it's the time honored tradition of the family, that the whole unit. When think about the world where you're in your house, your uncle and aunt are in the house next door, grandma and grandpa are across the street, that the
Right.
the whole unit used to be within a couple hundred meters of each other. Not long ago, 150, 200 years ago. And
Right.
then today, it's you might at minimum be 3 hours drive from your from your parents. That's super common. And so I can see that skill, or that it's interesting because I was saying I said skill, but then I realized it's the culture. And I think what you were pointing at earlier on was that the culture shift is happening, and that I think today we're awakening to the fact of like, where the heck are our mentors? Where are our role models? Why didn't dad help me out? And I think this, like, all this conversation, new books like the Two Parent Privilege, like there's all this study that's happening that, like, hey, that unit is critical
Oh,
to the development of your kids. But what do you think
absolutely.
about that?
Oh, yeah, I think you're totally correct. And I think the struggle, that a part of the struggle that we live with, is the storyline that we've been told is about the individual. Over the last over the last 70 years since I've been alive, the storyline that we've been told a lot is about the individual. And self determination, rugged individualism,
Mm,
particularly in the male community.
right.
Uh, we hear all of that, and yet the reality is you can't get from an infant to a healthy adult male as a rugged individualist. It just um,
And so
doesn't happen.
it's Lord of the Flies, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That's what
But,
happens
but
without direction.
you know what's really exciting is, and I'm trying to think the book. Oh, A Humankind
Okay. Yep.
is a fascinating book, and one of the things that the essence of the book is that we tend to think that Lord of the Flies is the reality.
Mm,
That when left to our own devices, we just go down to our basest instincts. In that book, the guy tells a story about he refers to it as a real life Lord of the Flies. And so, some island in the South Pacific, some kids decided to skip school and uh, take a fisherman's boat out just for a joyride in the course of the day. Storm came up, they got lost, and crash landed on an island. And everybody in the family had given those kids up for dead. As a matter of fact, they'd had funerals for all of them.
hmm.
And some boat was passing by months and months later, like maybe 6 months later or something like that, and saw some smoke from an island and said, "This is odd." And so they got out the binoculars and looked, and there were kids on the island.
Hmm.
And so what had happened was that these kids, when they crash landed on the islands, they said, "Okay, we got to figure out how to survive." And
Hmm.
what was actually created was the opposite of what Lord of the Flies was. They they figured out how to keep everybody healthy, and everybody had a job, and there were assignments as we go through the day to keep the fire going, and that when somebody was having a really tough time, they gave them a break. And so part of what that told me at our essence is the Lord of the Flies isn't a determined outcome.
Hmm.
That there is greater possibility.
I would imagine that the opposite construction probably comes from Hollywood,
Yes.
and likely comes from the it's much more interesting when there's high drama right on screen. But
So let me tell you another story just to justify, or not justify, but just to explain that. Do you remember that story about the woman who was stabbed to death in New York? This is I guess in the 60s, or maybe it was in the 70s. There was a story that came out that a woman was stabbed, and she lived in an apartment complex, and everybody heard her screams in the apartment complex, and no one came to help her, and she died alone on the streets. And so the guy, the writers of the book did some research on that story and uh, found the details of the story. Well, the reality was she died in the arms of a neighbor.
I was going to say I know that my brain was tickling and I was like, that's not true. I
Yeah.
remember that there was people did help, people were running, because the opposite, because I always look at the what was really foundational to me when I was young, just graduated college, was that was right when Katrina hit.
Hmm.
And the one thing I remember about Katrina was that, now this is for the Feel Good Fathers listening that may or may not know, right? Katrina hit, New Orleans is effectively destroyed.
Yeah.
Um, and but what was interesting was people were going back in on boats and rescuing others. People were, there's always been, if you watch any media or you watch any of these natural disasters, the entire community just comes together. And so
Right.
I completely agree with you. I definitely think it's a entertainment thing that's saying Lord of the Flies is the reality. But I completely see and understand that. Um, you know what? This also reminds me of the during the Blitz in London during World War II. A
Right.
lot of people have so many fond memories of them being in the shelter and being proximate to people that I think that when crisis happens, that people naturally change. There's a I would say a releasing of the petty nonsense. That there's a, we're in this together. It's about survival of the group. It's about, you know, the relationships you can build. And um, that it, humankind being that book, I think Feel Good Fathers, take a look at that. Have a
It's
little
a
more
good
faith
book.
in us, right?
Oh, and at the core, it's interesting because when we started doing family events for active duty military, uh, one of the things that we said was that if you want to grow any relationship, you have to do things together and you have to discuss things. And so, what you do together, how you do it, when you do it, who you do it with, what you discuss, how you discuss it, when you discuss it, who you discuss it with, that's what determines where the relationship grows. And the that has huge implications at home, and it also has huge implications in the workplace. Because fundamentally, if you want to develop anyone, it begins by building a relationship with them.
It sounds like if I'm taking your model of the skills, environment, culture,
Hmm.
it sounds like the skill for the feel good father is figure out how to do things together,
Right,
construct an environment where you're discussing things, and
right.
then it feels like culture, rather than being this intentional thing you're trying to create, it's a byproduct of the other actions.
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. Yeah. I think what the tendency is a lot for dads, particularly, is we want to do the right thing.
Hmm.
We want to um, feel like that what we're doing is making an impact, and maybe it's because we had somebody that did that for us, or maybe it's because we didn't have somebody do it for us, and and so we said, I want to do it for them. And what what our kids really want with us, and what our spouses want with us, is presence.
Hmm.
And when you do things with people without judgment, and when you have conversations with people without judgment, that is the physical act that makes somebody feel like you are present with them.
I think that's such a powerful perspective, because one of the feel good fatherhood principles is that abandoning of the ego. And so the common story is the sports dad with the video game son, right? Sports dad wants son to play sports. Video game son wants dad to play video games. And in that example, my whole thing is, hey, how about find that overlap? Maybe find a sports game that you can play with son so you can build a little bit of community and just spend that time, as we're saying, doing together. And that works for daughters as well. It's, as a
Totally.
girl dad, that's what I do with my daughters. It's I just find the things that she wants to do and figure out a way to either find a new activity that we're doing something together, or biting the bullet and watching and listening to what she wants to watch to and listen to.
Absolutely. Yeah. And
So
and the so one of the most fascinating events that we do with military families is service member daughter
mm,
retreats. We do service member daughter, service member son, whole family, couples. We do the whole thing.
mm,
But not having daughters, because we had three sons. Uh, I was I was just kind of curious. Okay, how is this going to go? And what we discovered almost from the moment that they walked in was it didn't matter. What they wanted was to do together.
yes, yes.
And and the dads that were focused enough and present enough realized it didn't make any difference what we did.
Yeah.
Whether it was a young girl and she's playing with dolls and wants dad to play with her, or whether it's an older girl who wants dad to explore some other things with her in terms of how she's thinking or what it is that she likes to do. And she might like athletics, and he might say, it's great, I like athletics too. Or it might be that she likes the arts. He has to figure out how to like the arts.
Yeah.
He doesn't have to be good at them. He just has to be able to walk into her world and appreciate it.
One of my favorite stories, and this is directly related to it. I used to, one of the other things I've done is I used to do partner dancing. So I did jazz dancing. It's called swing. And so I
Yeah,
did Lindy Hop and Balboa. You can kind of look it up online just to kind of see
that's
what that looks
fast.
like for folks.
Yeah.
And so when I was in my 20s, we did these kind of activities. And what I noticed And what I always pointed out, because in our young 20s, it was easy to be critical of the older couples hanging out. And so I grew up in Detroit. So lots of dive bars, lots of smoky establishments, all that kind of jazz. And I remember just very distinctly, I was in a super dive bar, and their music was playing. There was a band and they were dancing. And then as a table, some of the folks were kind of making fun of this guy that was dancing with his girl. And in that, like, not coordinated, didn't know how to, like, looked awkward. It was terrible. And they were kind of, poking fun at him and stuff like that. And I just said, y'all are looking at the wrong thing. And everybody was just kind of like, what's Jay talking about? And I said, he's up there enjoying himself. And if you look at his girl's face. And so everybody kind of looked at it, and she, huge smile, just delightful. And like, she had some rhythm and she had some flow. And so, she was, there's, you can tell when you're watching somebody that understands and feels the music versus somebody that doesn't necessarily have that. We just call it, they've got rhythm. And, and you could kind of tell, like, okay, she can move her body. She can do things. But I said, what's important to understand is that he's like sacrificing his look. He's getting rid of his ego. He's not too proud. He's just enjoying the moment and creating this environment. And I was like, would it not be worthwhile for each of us to kind of just learn from this example that it's not how well you do it, it's that you're doing it. And so in the example of, maybe daughter wants to do things that you don't enjoy, I think it's just kind of remember that you have that capability of putting a smile on somebody's face just by being present, just by doing it.
Right.
And it's not necessarily about whether or not it's your expertise,
Right.
right? But just that act of being willing and open to share that experience makes a difference, not only romantically with your spouse, but also with each of your kids.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you step into those spaces, there are actually 5 things that we will talk about
Mm,
that are really helpful. The first one is to stop, look, and listen. Just like what the policeman told us in the 3rd grade when he came, said, "Don't cross the street without stop, look, and listen."
mm,
And that's the first thing. You have to be able uh, to see the surroundings, see what's going on, and observe it instead of judge it. And that's the second thing is, observe instead of judge. And one of the
mm,
things that um, I think is difficult for a lot of guys is the idea that a child might think or act differently than they do, and they don't know what to do with that. And
mm.
sometimes they tend to judge that rather than observe it. Uh, and the next thing is to move toward, not away from. And that's a hard part for guys, I think sometimes.
So this is the I was talking with, oh, this is fascinating. I was talking with a child therapist, and she was saying one of the common activities that fathers do with daughters is that when they reach a certain age, there's a tendency to lean out. That's typically around puberty and the
Right.
becoming of a young woman. I didn't really get to, and I think that conversation is just around the discomfort of um, her. Well, it comes from, just, I think, for men being uncomfortable discussing the menstrual cycle. So, like,
Yeah.
I think that's where it comes from. But she was saying that one of the common byproducts of that time is that she doesn't like, she's kind of, major changes are happening for her, and then her first love is
Moving away.
leaning out because
Right.
of discomfort. And she was saying, you don't have to change anything, just stay present, keep the dynamics. And that's when you're saying towards, not away from. That's, it evoked that conversation for me, and I think as a feel good father, that should be paying attention. We should pay attention to that phenomena. But so that's three. So what's four and five?
Yeah. The fourth one is think liberating and limiting as opposed to good, bad, positive, or negative.
Mm,
Because
wh-
what
okay.
we do or how we think either frees us or holds us back. And the tendency is to want to judge the behavior or the dress or the actions of the other or their thought process.
Mm,
When in fact, if you think about it, so what is it we really want our children to become? And we have a bias. We have a bias that we want them to become good contributing citizens of whatever community that they're a part of.
mm,
And then we want them to be thinkers and adapters and problem
mm.
solvers and innovators, not people that just know how to follow the rules.
Right.
Because the world is too complex anymore. If we were back in the 1950s, that might have worked just perfectly fine.
Right.
When I was born in 53, it it was you followed the rules and you didn't step out very far outside of those rules. And if you did, you were clearly identified in the community as a troublemaker because you challenged anything. But yet the reality is today that the world is moving too fast. We have information from coming at us from so many directions.
Mm,
Do we want children to turn into adults who know how to just follow a set of rules, or do we want children who can think critically, who can
mm,
analyze, who can listen or watch or hear, and go, okay, that doesn't seem to connect right, or bingo, they're hitting it right on the mark. And so one of the ways that you do that is if you stop judging your kids' behavior and thought process and words, and instead start exploring that. And with the whole process of, okay, what part of that is actually freeing them to grow and what may be limiting their ability to grow? And that then leads to the last one, and that is ask instead of tell. As a dad, you should be asking questions about 80% of the time and telling about 20% of the time. And most of us
100%.
have been taught to tell about 80% of the time and ask about 20% of the time.
I think I think in today's world, and I just recently heard the statistic. It's that it's something like between 75 and 90% of people never feel heard or seen.
Exactly.
And this goes everywhere from your spousal relationship to your relationship with your parents to your coworkers, the whole deal. And it's just like this huge number. It's just like the vast majority of people. And I was thinking, I think in addition to all these other elements that we've been talking about, I think one of the great mythological lessons to take from all of our heroes is that concept of sacrifice for progress, sacrifice for that next tier. And in this particular context, like asking instead of telling, that yes, feel good father, you might feel not unseen, unheard, but what a gift you can do to change, to just extend that to the people in your life. And I know that I personally experienced this, is that when I switch out of the telling mode and into an asking mode, or into I call it curiosity, becoming curious,
Right.
it does change. It does create an environment. And since our kids parrot us, one of the great things that I've personally experienced is that my daughter is actually interested in what I do.
Yeah.
So I'll ask her all these things. And then on occasion, not very frequently, but on occasion, she's like, "Hey, Dad, how was your day?"
Yeah.
It's like, whoa, whoa, where's this coming from? And so I love this model. I think it really aligns with the feel good father way. Um, so this, I think, is an introduction to the larger concept that we were talking about off air, which is parenting as leadership.
Right.
So we've kind of opened this circle. Let's close this circle. Let's continue that discussion. So parenting as leadership. What are your thoughts of that?
So absolutely, parenting is leadership. Leadership by definition is the influencing of other people to
Mm,
achieve an outcome. And
right.
in this case, the outcome as parents that we want is for our kids to be the type of adults where they are not only good contributing citizens in the world that they are in, but they're emotionally, physically, and mentally healthy, and that they are building the relationships, they are building the connections, they are doing the things in their life that help them thrive and succeed. I said that's so. So that's, if a leader in an organization has a particular goal that they have to achieve, but leadership is not about the goal. Leadership is about the process that you develop in your organization to get to the goal.
Mm,
And that's the exact same thing from a parenting standpoint. Is is that if we say, look, we want our kids to be strong, we want them to be both independent and interdependent, that we
mm,
want them to be able to think critically and to love others and all of the other attributes. Well, there's a process that has to happen if we want
mm.
that outcome.
I love what you said because I want to read. You said it's not only independent but also interdependent,
Oh yeah,
and I think that it's really interesting because one of the things that differentiates humanity from other animals is literally our ability to work together. And because of now, there are other animals that do work together. I'm thinking about like how dolphins they'll
right,
corral to see a fish to hunt. Wolves are very well known as being pack animals and stuff like that. But there's a sophistication to what we've been like because we've been needed to work together. We've developed language in all these other inventions, all these other technologies that, for lack of a better word, create more deeper and more complex, more interesting um, connections. And I would advise that interdependence is not a bad thing. Being reliant and being able to lean on others is a great show of. I personally think not only leadership, because one of my leadership principles that I learned way back in the day was, and let me know what you think, is that um, the best leaders also know when to follow.
oh absolutely,
And so that's something that in my years of playing hockey and sports, that's what I was almost always captain of the team. So, and when I wasn't, I was assistant, and that was just one of the big things was sometimes you just got to follow
hmm
somebody else's lead or somebody else's energy in that situation.
right,
So there was another concept here that I thought is very related to a lot of the discussions that are happening today in parenting.
right,
And for you, it's this concept of the errors of leadership. Because when we're what I think and what I hear when I hear you describe it, what I hear is a lot of parenting theory that really do map to what you're talking about. So can you describe for us this errors of leadership concept?
absolutely. So what we discovered as we were doing research and developing a new model was that since the end of World War II, there have been three eras in leadership, and particularly leadership and power and leadership models. There was centralized leadership from post World War II until the mid to late 60s. And in that centralized era, everything was very centralized at home, at school, at work, and everywhere. It was a very hierarchical
Hmm.
structure back then.
Hmm.
And the leader was the boss, the parent was the boss, the minister was the boss, the teacher was the
Mm,
boss. And uh, the whole structure was built around submitting to the boss or giving deference to the boss. And the whole culture worked back then like that because what people valued in that era was security. And so it all kind of
mm,
fit together. And around the mid 60s, two things happened that were absolutely critical. And the first one was the social revolution. So, feminist movement, civil rights movement said, we want a voice and we want a seat at the table. In the workplace, we also had the issue of quality and productivity issues because one of the things that made the US so successful in the post World War II era was that we were the only economy that was thriving in the world. And so quality and productivity wasn't as important back then. Well, By the time we hit the mid 60s, the rest of the world had recovered, and they were taking the US economy to task. And they were creating better products, better services, speed of delivery, a lot of other things. And American companies said, wait a minute, we've got to catch up. Well, the problem, if you have an authoritarian, hierarchical culture, is that it's hard to solve problems because you have to put people together in teams to solve problems. You have to cross departmental lines. And so that literally forced us in the business community to start talking to each other. And so two things happened during that era. The continuous improvement model was really birthed during that era. Edward Deming actually took it to Japan post World War II, which is one of the reasons that their economy really accelerated fast. And then because the US said, nah, we don't need that right now. We're good. And so once the US began to adopt that continuous improvement model, again, which is built on teams, it's built on leaders engaging team members to understand what's going on and fix problems. Then our economy began to accelerate just like any other one that uses that. And the leadership model began to shift. So in that centralized era, the responsibility of the leader was to manage people back in that post World War II era. In this centralized or in this middle era, which we call the shared power era, the team model became dominant, and the leadership model began to be built around managing and motivating people. And in 1971, Richard Greenleaf wrote an article entitled Servant Leadership. And anybody that knows leadership knows what has happened after that. Servant leadership became the dominant leadership model in the era of shared power from the mid to late 60s on into right up to the millennium. So you had centralized power, 1945 to roughly the mid to late 60s. Then you had shared power from right around 1970 all the way up for 30 years up to the turn of the millennium. And then our theory is we've moved into a different era now. And this era is very different than that shared power era. The speed of change, the rapid development of technology, the affordability of technology, the scaling of technology, frustration with corporate life. There are a number of factors. Globalization, those are the factors that pushed us into the third era that we refer to as given power. So you have centralized power to shared power to given power. And this era, uh, the rules of the game have changed. The speed of change has accelerated so much and continues to accelerate. Now we're seeing AI coming in and being a part of that literally everywhere. And where does the power need to be? That's the question we started asking. So if as an organization, if as a parent, if I want to excel as an organization and the family unit as an organization,
Mm.
is where does the power need to be? And our theory is that we need to put the power in the hands of our people. And we need to develop them to be able to use that power to help us grow the organization. Or if it's a family unit, to help grow the resiliency and the strength of the family unit. And Patty and I were talking yesterday. Patty's my wife. That we're the last generation that didn't grow up with a phone in our hands.
Right.
And think about the importance of, does somebody know how to use that power that is in the palm of their hand now? Well, if you're not equipping people to do that, if you're not developing our children, our coworkers, the folks that are on our teams, if we're not developing people to use that power, then we lose what it is we want to create. Because we if they don't have the skill sets and the confidence to use that power effectively, then we have not done this generation justice. Because the reality
Mm.
is, it's speeding up world. It's going to, everything's going to change. we can't go back to Leave It to Beaver in the 1950s as much
Right.
as some people would like us to. We can't go back there anymore. The solution is to develop them. And so, our theory from a leadership standpoint is we've moved from managing people to managing and motivating people to developing people.
Mm.
Development is the essence of leadership in the 21st century.
These are so fascinating, such great ideas, and I think the Feel Good Father is has definitely has a lot of food for thought. Links to contact John and get in touch with him will be down in the description. Um, any closing thoughts or comments for our Feel Good Fathers and parenting and leadership models?
Oh, absolutely. The future that is in front of us is incredibly exciting. We have to learn to think differently and we have to learn to act differently in order to create the future that we want for our kids, for our businesses, and for our communities.
Absolutely love it. John Brantley, everybody.
Thank you.